If you're interested in learning to trade on Betfair, then visit the BetAngel Academy, where you have detailed, structured Betfair trading courses. Or why not visit our website where you can download a free trial of BetAngel Professional, but also visit the forum where you can get detailed images, examples, and downloadable files. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell icon if you want notification of new videos as they're released. So one of the things that you'll notice when you're Betfair trading is there are many aspects to it. I think it's a common misconception that you turn up, somebody teaches you a simple trading method, and that's it. You just run off and start printing money. Now, that would be nice, wouldn't it? But the reality is somewhat different. And you have to look at many different aspects of the trade that you're doing and the way that you trade and the sport that you're looking at and so on. So it's multifaceted. You know, there's just not one aspect to it. Just because you have a strategy doesn't mean that you're able to trade profitably. You have to look at many different things. So over a vast number of years, I've explored every single aspect of the market, how the market works, why it's priced that way, what influences price, and all of those things. But one of the areas that I've also looked at is the psychology of trading. Now, that's not just the psychology of the way that you trade. I've probably spent a big chunk of time over the last 5 to 10 years exploring specifically the psychology. And again, that's multifaceted because it's not just your psychology, but you have to look at the psychology of the sport underneath. And the thing that sort of prompted me to look at the psychology of a sport predominantly was tennis, because when I first started trading tennis, you know, a player would be dominant and you sort of think, oh, well, they're going to win this, so I won't bother hedging it, at which point it all fell apart. And the other way round, you would think, oh, all is lost, I may as well take this loss and forget about it, at which point it all turned around in the other direction. So I was thinking, well, that's odd. So my introduction to looking at the psychology of sport, and I've done it on all different sports, football, tennis, golf, and to an extent racing, that's a little bit more curious. You know, you realize that there's stuff going on within the match itself. So what I was looking at in tennis was choking, which is what you can see on the screen behind me. Players would choke at certain key points within the match. And I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. I wonder if I can understand why that happens. So yeah, I started delving into the psychology of things. If you're interested and you want to know what sort of books I read, it's these sort of books here, because I'm really interested in things at a deep level. I want to understand what actually goes on inside people's heads, because ultimately trading is about what happens next. So when you're looking at an individual sport, you can model it, you can map it, but you also want to understand what influences that price activity, because everybody else can model it to varying degrees, and they may have different angles to you. So you have to have an angle on that. But yeah, if you can understand what's going on inside the player's mind, that will help you understand what's going to happen next within the individual sport. So yeah, if you look at all individual sports, they have these characteristics. I've spotted all sorts of interesting things in golf, and in football, and in tennis, and in racing, that cut across the entire market for a number of reasons, whether it's to do with the betting, whether it's to do with the actual sport itself. So it's really interesting to dig underneath that. So I went off and read loads of books about the psychology of tennis, trying to understand what coaches were telling the players and how that could give me sort of leverage in terms of trying to understand what players were likely to do in an individual situation within a match. Now, the thing is, you know, how deep do you want to go? Because there are multiple layers in which you can go down deeper and deeper and deeper. So, you know, I spend a lot of time on the periphery of what's possible. I'm really interested in doing something new and interesting and exciting. And so, you know, you don't have to go to this level to trade effectively. However, if you do, then you'll be able to squeeze out a little bit more of an edge. So I've often spoken to professional sports people to try and understand the way that they approach something and understand what influences that, because I know that that will allow me to sort of get in slightly ahead of what is going on. It's sort of almost magical when you sort of say, I think this is going to happen. And then sure enough, before long, it does happen. And I remember in football once I sat next to a football manager, and he was getting annoyed by something, and he made a statement that suddenly reflected and made me think, oh, hold on a second, is that true? And sure enough it was, because a few minutes later it happened. And he turned to me and sort of said, like, I told you so. So it's interesting, because a combination of all these things, don't want to ramble for too long here, have got me interested in the psychology of the actual sport itself. So yeah, you can have it at a top level, or you can go much, much deeper if you so wish. But that was my incentive, was to try and understand exactly what would happen next. So on tennis, I was pondering for ages about how could I actually get inside the head of a player. What is there that I could see that would influence exactly what was likely to happen going forward. So I was sort of pondering about what to do on this for some time, when an example came up that was absolutely set perfectly for exactly what I was looking for. So it was the 2014 Australian Open final between Stan Wawrinka and Rafa Nadal, and it was very apparent fairly early on that Rafa had a problem. Now, at first he didn't really show it, and the crowd were getting a bit upset because he was taking medical timeouts and stuff like that. But before long, it became apparent that he had a bit of a back spasm. If you've ever had one, you know how painful that is. And basically he went on to lose the final simply because of this back problem. Now, after every match or every race, and I always go back and look through data, especially when interesting things happen. I archive all of the data that I can get my hands on, and then go back and look and see if I could find something. So I looked into the data on that particular match, which you can also see on the screen, and that sort of was leading me in the direction of, could I have possibly predicted this? Could I have worked out that Rafa had a problem before everybody became generally aware of it? Were there little tells that I could pick up on that were able to give me an indication as to what was going on in his head, and that was a reflection of what was going on in his body. So I looked at all of the data, but didn't really pick up on anything from there. But then all of a sudden it dawned on me that what I was really looking for was the serve. Basically, if you've got a back problem, you're not going to be serve at full strength, and therefore you saw his service speed start to drop off. So that was the first indication that there was a problem. And I was thinking about this, and in the case of an injury, that's fairly obvious. If you can't reach the ball and you can't hit it as hard, that's going to show up in the data, and you can act upon that. And that got me thinking about, well, I wonder if I look at individual points, exactly how that influences the outcome of the serve. Does that give me some insight to look inside the tennis player's mind? So I set off to have a look at if there is a difference and if tennis players play different points differently. And the short answer is yes, they do. So there you go. There's the answer to the video. But obviously I'm going to go in a little bit more depth. So when you look at service ratings, you go to the ATP or WTA sites, and you can get loads of data in terms of how individual players are performing. So when you look at the first serve percentages for the men are sort of in the late 60s, perhaps even early 70s at the very, very highest level. And that obviously declines as you go down the rankings. But basically there's a really good chance that you're going to win a point on your first serve. So if we look at the data behind me, you can see that getting a first serve in is quite high, but then winning a point on that first serve is even higher. So if you get that first serve in, then basically you will get a point, or it's very likely that you'll get a point. So you can see here it ranges sort of, late 70s, early 80s for the top ranked players. If you get that serve in, you're going to win a point. So I was quite interested in, if they're nervous about getting a serve in, they'll probably slow it down. Or perhaps, if they're running away with the game, perhaps they'll slow it down. Or perhaps they'll speed it. I wanted to know, I was like, what actually happens within that particular scenario. So imagine that you're 40 love up, you're going to serve, you may as well try something clever perhaps, or perhaps try and humiliate your opponent by doing an unusual serve. We have seen this in a couple of tournaments. But if you're love 40 down, you've got to win that particular point. If you don't win that point, then you're going to get broken, and therefore you probably want to put in a really, really good serve. You're going to hit it as hard as you can and try and get the best serve possible so that your opponent doesn't have the chance to return the serve. Because, if you have to play a second serve, then obviously the issue that you're going to have is the second serve is obviously slower, and the chance of you winning a point, as you can see from the stats behind me, on second serve is much lower as well. So I thought, well, let's not try and prejudice the data. Let's go off and find some data and see if we can understand exactly what that says and if that describes what's going on within the head of a tennis player when they're playing a tennis match. And that is what I did. Now, the interesting thing is, when you look at data across tennis tournaments now, there is unbelievable amounts of data available. So this data taken from behind me is on the ATP site, and this basically lays out how a player serves at certain points within the game. I mean, how better does it get than that? It's amazing how much data has come on, and it's an absolute godsend for sports traders, because for many years I would gather data myself, and it was long, slow, laborious, and you weren't guaranteed an edge. Now it's all just presented to you free of charge, and you can interrogate and have a look at how individual player traits are on a tennis court. So my recommendation for you, if you play tennis, is go off to the ATP site, have a look at how they're likely to play, and that will give you a little bit of insight into how a player is likely to respond given certain scorelines. It's absolutely wonderful to be able to do this. Now, when I was looking at it, what I did was I went back through all of the data. There are some really good databases on tennis that will allow you to look up a variety of different characteristics of those individual players and data that's collected on a regular basis. And I basically arranged all of them in the possible range of scores that you could get within a match. So it's 40 love, love 40, 15 all, 30 40, 40 30, and so on. And you can see them all ranked behind me on this particular screen. And what I actually did was I applied a rank to them, which I'll explain in a second. But you can also see there's a balance figure, which is basically saying the player is very far ahead or very far behind. So you can see the higher the balance figure, the more likely it is that the player is behind on points. But basically, if it's a negative figure, then they're many points in front of their opponent. And you can see that there's a rough correlation in that the negative balance numbers are at the top and the positive balance numbers are at the bottom. In other words, the ones at the top are showing when a player is dominant and is winning that particular game easily, and the ones at the bottom are where they're not winning the game so easily. So what is the rank? How have I ranked them then? Because I'm obviously not ranking them by balance, because you can see a -3 at 14, 15. And you can see there's a 2 appearing sort of just over halfway down that particular list. But what you're actually looking at is the rank is the speed of serve. So basically, when a player is 40 love up, they serve at their absolute fastest. And when they're love 40 down, they serve at their absolute slowest, which is a bit weird. I didn't quite expect it to be like that, because if you're about to lose the game, you would think that they would probably serve a little bit harder. But in fact, it seems to be the other way around, which was a little bit odd. And if they're 40 love up, you know, perhaps they've got nothing to lose, so they may as well serve it. But look at some of the discrepancies you see here. Advantage 40, 40 30, 40 15 are all subtly slightly different. But if it's at love all, 15 all, 30 all, 40 all, they sort of cluster. It seems to sort of gravitate to a mean around that particular point in time. So it was interesting to see, because, you know, what we're effectively doing here is we're not looking at how fast a player serves at any one particular point, because if they were logical, rational beings, they would basically just serve the same on every single point, perhaps varying it slightly now and again. But what we actually see, in fact, is a discrepancy according to the score within that underlying game. So different players play different points differently at different parts of the game, which is quite curious. And I hadn't expected to find such a wide variation. Now, the data you see behind me is grouped across a whole range of players. So it's a general look at what happens. Individual players do play slightly differently. Like I said, that's, if you look at the site that I showed on the slide beforehand, that would give you a little bit of deeper insight into how they're likely to play. But what I was more interested in is there something there? Is there a discrepancy between a 40 love and a love 40? Because if there is, then that probably means that you're getting a look inside their mind in terms of how they're likely to play. So yeah, when I looked at tennis, I figured out that service speed was giving me a proxy for basically how confident a player was that they were likely to win a point. And using that sort of data will basically allow you to improve your ability to be able to trade the match, because you'll be able to see when they're feeling confident or not, and that gives you a little bit of a heads up as to whether you think that they're actually about to turn this match around or not, or indeed how they're feeling at that particular moment in time. And you tend to find that winners, when players are confident, they tend to go for winners more than when they're not confident. And in fact, if they stop trying to hit the winners, they're waiting for the other player to make a mistake. So if that other player does tend to go for the winners, then the whole match is imbalanced at that particular point. So like I said, it's like how deep down the rabbit hole do you want to go? But nonetheless, you know, I was looking for some sort of a proxy for how a player was thinking. And it turned out that actually the service speed that they had on serve was giving me a bit of a clue as to how that was likely to play out. So yeah, you know, there's a lot of depth there. Don't expect you to immediately jump into the market and do something based upon this. But I thought it would give you an interesting level of insight into how a tennis player thinks when they're playing a game.